Here.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay, we have a quorum. And next is public comment. Jessica or Hitesh, do we have anyone signed up for public comment?
I see William Smith, but he must be reporting about. Other than that, I don't see anyone on the screen or listed.
Trish Connolly?
Tisha Connolly, okay.
Ms. Connolly, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Tricia Conley, Second Ward. I am interested in what this group can do in regards to looking at the forecast of the next 5 years in the budget based on the capital improvements, and really take a fine-tooth comb and a focus on the amount of bonding that I guess is so typical for us here in Evanston, but I would love us to see about doing something a bit differently and planning a bit differently so that we don't continue to have such a hardship on our community with bonding out and what we're paying out to do some of these projects, and really consider how many of these projects have to happen in a year, what can be put off, and be very considerate of that. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. That's a very good question. And I think that's what this committee, one of the critical issues this committee needs to look at. If no one else is here for public comment, the next item is approval of the minutes. Would someone like to make a motion regarding the minutes of January 11th?
I move approval of the minutes of the January 11th meeting of the Finance and Budget Committee.
I will second.
Thank you. Hitesh, could you call the roll?
Okay, let's do the roll call. Councilmember Wynn,
Aye.
Councilmember Burns, Councilmember Kelly,
Here. Aye.
Councilmember Newsma,
Aye.
Councilmember Reed. Okay, he moved.
Aye.
Okay, so yeah, Member Livingston,
Aye.
Member McMillan,
Aye.
and Member Rikers.
Aye.
Thank you.
All right, the minutes are approved. So we're going to move on to our first item of discussion, or our main topic of discussion tonight, which is the City of Evanston's capital improvement plan, including funding. And to lead us through this discussion tonight, we have Lara Biggs, whose current title is, Lara, what is your current title?
So I'm the Bureau Chief of Capital Planning and Engineering.
Thank
and then I have a second title, which is City Engineer.
Okay, that's the one I just go by. You know,
Yeah, that's the
like
legal
that's the
title.
catch-all. Okay, right. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As Councilmember Wynn indicated, I'm the City Engineer. I oversee the Capital Improvement Program, and thank you, committee, for having me here to talk about the program. Let me just share my screen. I have a PowerPoint prepared.
And thank you for the materials that you sent us in the packet. It's very helpful.
Sure. Okay, so some of this is a little repetitive with the budget presentation, and then some of that we did in October, and then some of it diverges into some new material. So the first question that often comes up is, how do we develop the capital improvement program? So our project ideas come from many places. The maintenance staff play a really big portion in this, in that they bring up concerns such as whether or not they're removing playground equipment, such like Independence Park, because it's no longer safe. Other concerns are related to building facilities. Then we also use adopted plans that have been approved by the City Council. So we are very slowly modernizing our streetlight system in compliance with the streetlight master plan adopted by the City Council in 2019. So we do look at those plans to come up with certain types of projects. Council member and community member suggestions. The new skate park is an example of this, where a couple of council members really pushed for this, and largely as a result of community members requesting that we have a skate park facility. Legal requirements are another area. The ADA transition plan update that's going on currently is a legal requirement for the city. Lead surface line replacement is another type of legal requirement where we implement stuff in the capital improvement program. And then 311 issues that are raised, and sidewalk repairs is an example of those are up until now have been completed largely based on complaints lodged through the 311 system. Let me move on. Next slide. So we have, it's hard to believe, but we begin working on developing the next year's CIP by May. So we're already holding internal meetings, particularly on street resurfacing and water main, where we have to do a lot of forward-thinking design work in order to have that project ready the following year. We do then develop a list of potential projects, which is internally reviewed with city management in August and September. The budget is posted in October, which allows the capital improvement program to be publicly reviewed. And in October and November, we're typically receiving comments from the city council. Once the budget is adopted, we take that and we incorporate those changes into the next year's work plan and begin work for the following year. Whoops, wrong. Oh yeah, that's the right slide. Okay, sorry. So in order to make our capital improvement program easier to monitor, then we actually divide it into categories. And it used to be published in the budget this way. It's a little bit different with ClearGov, but the staff is still using these categories. Typically, our capital improvement program is around $50 million a year. We're at $64 million for 2022, but we have two large projects that are inflating it this year. The 30-inch transmission main project is going to be around $12 million by itself. And the water plant intake, which is approximately a $40 million project, has $8 million budgeted in 2022. This slide talks about what our different funding sources are. The capital improvement program uses a lot of different funding sources, and almost all of the funding sources have some very specific limitations about the type of project that it goes to or the geographic boundary of where it's located. So enterprise funds, which includes the water fund, the sewer fund, and parking fund, they can only be spent on assets related specifically to that fund. And similarly, when we get loans from the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, those are funneled through the water and sewer fund. So again, only on water and sewer assets. The motor fuel tax is another thing where it can only be spent on street and transportation improvements. And any improvement we do with MFT funds have to be designed to an Illinois Department of Transportation standard, which is not always ideal for the community. So if we're not going to conform those standards, we pay for it separately. Community development block grant funds, we as staff apply to a city commission, the Housing and Community Development Committee, which approves projects annually on a year-by-year basis. Tax increment finance funds can only be used within the geographic boundaries of a TIF. You know, other sources of funding include things like private donations from organizations like the Levy Center Foundation or Evanston Environment Association. In this year, 2022, that actually includes proceeds from the sale of city property, which is so far the building at the North Branch Library building that was on Central Street. So out of all of this, general obligation bonds are actually the least restricted and most flexible funding sources. So we do try to keep those between 10 to 11 million or even under 10 million. The 12.9 million that's shown in this slide includes money not just from bonds sold in 2022, but $2.4 million from prior year bonds. And when we look at the capital improvement program, I'm actually going to talk a lot about general obligation bonds because I've been getting a lot of questions about how we spend debt service. So of the total capital improvement program, only 20% of the capital improvement program is funded by the general obligation bonds that are abated by property tax. We do annually tend to sell other bonds that are abated by the water fund or the sewer fund or tax increment finance revenues. But the ones that seem to be of most concern are those GO bonds that are abated specifically by property tax. And what this slide doesn't show, but which we're going to talk about in a little bit, are that GO bonds actually are directed heavily into funding certain categories of the CIP. So if you talk about reducing general obligation bond debt, you're talking about reducing portions of the CIP, not the entire CIP. This slide is really important to understand as we talk about funding the capital improvement program, because a CIP project does not usually fit neatly into 12-month operating increments, such as our operating budget. Our projects go over a really long time period. So typically, even before it makes it on the CIP, but definitely after it makes it on the CIP, we're in a planning phase that will last 2 to 5 years. And we're really setting the location, scope, and funding during that planning phase. Most public input actually occurs during this phase, and a lot of key project decisions are made during this phase. Then we move into design phase, which usually is much shorter, 6 to 12 months. That is when we've made all the decisions about what the project is going to look like, and the staff or consultant that's doing the design fill in all of the contract details, the drawings and the specifications that are going to be bid. Then we move into construction, which depending on the project usually takes 3 to 24 months to build. That is, again, when the public sees the project. They typically don't hear from us much during the design phase. And so there can be a real gap there between when public made decisions and when it's actually under construction. And then in project closeout, this can take quite a long period, particularly on projects that use outside funding sources where the city doesn't necessarily control the closeout process. This can go for a long period of time. So projects involving federal or state transportation funds are administered by the Illinois Department of Transportation, and they're notorious for taking 6 to 10 years to close out their projects, at which point the city will have, say, 60 days to make a final payment, often totaling several $1 million. Since all of our financial transactions at the state, from the state, all go through the state of Illinois Comptroller's office, if we fail to make that payment, it can hold up any other state funding that we're getting. So you could get like a food grant or a nutrition grant that all of a sudden you don't get money for because you haven't paid the fee, the $3 million bill on a project that was completed 3 years ago that you didn't know was going to be invoiced at this particular time.
Lara, is that just with IDOT?
IDOT primarily, that's the biggest one, but that's partly because they're the biggest organization that we get outside funding through in the capital program.
Lara, what is it that they're doing that takes, I noticed the 2 examples you gave were projects that we built in 2018 and 2019. And, you know, is this arguing over change orders, or is it just delay in billing? You know, or what's causing the state to be that far behind?
So after a project, well, while a project is construction, but IDOT tends to lag behind, the contractor makes submittals for materials and things, and IDOT doesn't necessarily approve those before the project is built. And so all of those go through an IDOT process of review. And then if they're not in compliance, then they argue with the contractor, how much are they going to pay? Sometimes there are issues that come up during construction, and just the way IDOT, all of these federal grant projects, the construction contract's actually held by IDOT. So we might raise an issue like, hey, this isn't what we thought was going to happen, but IDOT won't slow the project down. So we're often arguing those things afterwards. And then after all that paperwork is done, they go back, they check all the quantities. The consulting engineer, usually who did the construction monitoring fills out a bunch of paperwork about how much was completed, and they sign off on everything, and there's a back and forth, and then they finally do all the calculations and determine how much we owe at the very end.
Is that typical of other states too, that they have the same type of long lag time?
I'm not really sure.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
haven't worked with other departments of transportation.
I'm just wondering if, if this is sort of just how state departments of transportation operate, or whether Illinois is special,
Well, as with all things, Illinois is a little special. And I think that it could also be other departments of transportation around the country, but I would suspect that Illinois is somewhat unique in their process. And I think that often what we see is that every few years there's a push to close out projects, and then we close out 2 or 3 projects at once. So it isn't just one $2 million payment that's due. It might be several. And then we don't hear from them on the, because they'll ask us for some final documentation too. Then we don't hear from them again for a while.
And I think one of the issues too is, as we discussed, Lara, previously with Dave, is that we've bonded out years ago and had millions and millions sitting in bank accounts because of, what appears to be unobligated funds. But you were saying, no, it is obligated for these IDOT projects, for example. But I think, to me, I see like we definitely have an issue with having money sitting in bank accounts for years, and again, millions. I think there should be a way that we can look at this so that, because what we're paying in interest on the bonds is not we're not being compensated by what we're getting in savings accounts. So it seems like there should be some way that we can get a better grasp on, project completion, so we don't just keep money in the bank for years and years, so that we have it ready for that 60-day period of time.
Well, we don't know when that 60-day period of time is going to occur, but there's also a standard, and maybe Tesh can weigh in on this too, that when you enter into a contract, you don't have to have all the funding. I mean, some of our contracts are budgeted over 5 years. Well, not usually. Let's say 3 years. The Central Street Bridge, for example, is budgeted over 3 years. But when the contractor spends that money, the city has to have it. So if we have a project that's going to be in construction for 2 or 3 years, we don't have to have all of the money at the beginning of the period, but we have to have all the money when it's being spent. How long it takes to close out construction is a totally different discussion. But when we spend the money, which is when the contractor does work, we have to have the money to pay them. We can't just say, oh, you spent the money, we'll get the money 5 years from now, don't worry about it.
Well,
that is not a good financial practice.
Right, but not 5 years. But I think that maybe it might be good to just see if there is a way that we can have a tighter schedule so that we don't have so much money in savings account for so long.
Right. And Claire, I agree with you on that. I think that's something though that has to change at the state level, not necessarily something that we could do, but maybe this is an issue we raise with our state legislators.
Or maybe we open conversations also with them so that we track it better too. I just would encourage us to look into ways that we can not have money losing interest.
I agree with you. I have 2 hands here. First Devon, and then David Livingston.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Quick question, or maybe clarification for Laura. Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned that both parking fund allocate funds, as well as I think you mentioned not motor fuel tax, parking funds, and water and sewer improvement funds are limited to, those enterprise funds are limited to the enterprise. But is it not a common practice that the city ports money from those enterprise funds to the general fund, and then those funds are expended, as general funds are expended?
Yes, but I will defer to Hitesh because
Yes.
he'll explain that better than I will.
Right. So, Councilmember Reed, yeah, we make what we call a transfers, interfund transfers, and we kind of put the legitimate amount, like, okay, what is like, suppose parking fund or water fund pay for like administrative service, right? We have an audit done for banking service we provide to those funds. Like water fund, we take it for the, like when the plant was installed, and I think Dave is there too, he can talk about that too, that we charge what we call a return on investment for that plant set up there. Same thing for parking. What are the reasonable fees? Same thing, we charge token money, like a transfer of 10, 15,000 to a TIF fund based on the banking services, auditing services, part of the single audit reporting. So the reasonable time of the staff, which are charged in general fund, and we kind of come up with that and transfer that money.
But just to be clear, we do that for more than just those things you list. Sometimes, for example, if the city had a budget crunch and there was an additional $1 million sitting in the parking fund, we both have and are able to transfer those surplus funds from the parking fund to the general fund and expend it however we would like. Correct?
Yeah, once it comes into the general fund, you can do that. I mean, I at least know about a couple of instances where like parking fund has loaned the general fund money and we paid it back. Like when we bought the system, New World system, there was a 5-year loan program from parking fund to the general fund. But the general fund returned that money back to the parking fund.
Okay, but I just want to, just for understanding how all of this works, of course, motor fuel tax, that's regulated by the state, so we cannot spend that outside of the state regulations. There's some other things, but with those enterprise funds, we do have wide flexibility in how we spend those dollars.
You can do that. Absolutely, you're right. As long as city council says, yes, we want to do that. The only thing is the auditors might mention in their audit report that we saw a $3 million transfer from water fund or parking fund to pay for X expenses in the general fund. And that would go bad maybe with the rating agency. They look at our budget, they look at reading, even sometimes they tell me and say, okay, yeah, I saw the last budget meeting, you guys talked about this. So yeah, it might hurt us in that sense.
Yeah, and then my last just comment, no response needed, but it certainly makes a lot of sense when it comes to the water fund, given our huge unfunded liability with keeping up with our water mains and all that stuff, to not transfer out to the general fund. With the parking fund, I think we're doing pretty good there. So just, there is both the legal and the, financial flexibility to use those parking fund dollars in a wider array of situations than just relating directly to maintaining our parking garages or the parking enterprise. Thank you, Chair.
David?
Sure. So just this goes back a little bit to our meeting last month on funding, but the way that a corporation would deal with the issue that Claire brought up is you wouldn't typically borrow large amounts of money, pay a lot of interest on it, and have it sitting in a bank earning nothing. Absolutely the case. You would have a short-term credit facility up to a certain amount of money that you can draw on quickly. And then as the need arises to create capacity under that short-term credit facility, you would then bond that money. So you sort of, you don't end up sort of raising money years before you need it and paying large amounts of interest. So Tesh, I don't know if that sort of structure is something we could talk about separately, but
that's a good point. And just to kind of, sorry to interrupt you, but we have used the line of credit. Obviously, the line of credit, the only biggest downside of line of credit is it's tied into a variable rate. It's tied into some index. So suddenly, like suppose this year, I'm getting the email from my that okay, there might be 5 rate increases here.
Mm-hmm. But so, to David's point, it's a short-term use. You're bridging something to a longer term.
But my point is, at the same time, where we could use the line of credit. Like if I'm building a project like $10 million, and if I go for a line of credit, and if I have to pay back, I mean, where would I bring the money? It would be a tax levy.
Well, I think that's through your bonding, right? I mean, we know eventually we're going to issue a long-term bond for this project, but we don't want to raise the money years before we actually need it. So money is fungible too. I think we can also start tying borrowing too much to a truck, to
And the-
whatever it is. Ultimately, there's a relationship between revenue or whatever measure that gives you a feel for how levered the organization is, the city is. And so just an idea, and maybe we can look for other communities that might do it, but how do we keep away from borrowing for dead money? Right.
And that's a
one
good point. Yeah. I mean, one thing, and again, I mean, you mentioned a couple of other communities. That's a good point. Particularly what we do is, I mean, the other communities too, they prefer to have a short-term borrowing for the TIF funding because it's a taxable funding. It's not tax exempt. So it costs a little bit more. And I have seen so many communities, particularly and the limits, the needs are limited under $5 million. They would, instead of going for a bond and pay all the cost of issuance, they would rather go for line of credit. What happens in our case, that generally we issue the bonds every year, so it becomes part of the thing. So there's no additional cost of issuing the bond.
Okay. So maybe we can talk about that separately.
Absolutely.
How do we
That's, yeah.
minimize the interest we spend on money that we don't really need today? And I take your point that we are in an increasing rate environment, and that can change over time. We're trying to set a long-term strategy for what we want to do. But, you know, actually short-term funding rarely gets above the rate you pay on long-term bonds. You can be overly conservative. There should probably be some element of borrowing that we're comfortable in having floating, because almost never does short-term money end up being higher than long-term money, and it wouldn't stay that way for a significant period of time. So just something we might want to. Rates are definitely going up. So
Absolutely.
you know, definitely going up, but long-term, short-term is a lot cheaper than.
Yeah.
Long-term.
All good points. I have Dave Stoneback, who's had his hand raised for quite a while. Dave?
Hi, I just want to make a comment on Council Members Reid about taking money from the water or sewer fund. Such a large portion of our capital projects are funded from IEPA loans. And when we take those loans, we have to share with them our 20-year forecast so that they see that we have the funding to repay the loan amount. And when we provide those projections, we do not imply that there would be one-time transfers from the water fund to the general fund or something like that. So if that were to happen, that City Council would decide to take money because they're short in the general fund some year from the water or sewer fund, that could really impact our ability to obtain IEPA loans in the future. So I just want to bring that out.
Yeah, Chair, if I can just very briefly respond. Yeah, as I noted specifically that I just that point that I believe with the water and sewer fund, it doesn't make sense as much, although we do have the legal flexibility. To me, the parking fund, given its stability over the last few years, is a better fund, or a better example of a fund that could be used more flexibly. I do also want to ask, this is relating to the IEPA loans. Is there interest tied to those loans, or are those no interest loans?
There is interest. I'm sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, they are low interest loans. They're generally, right now they're 1.5%, but I would imagine next year that they're going to go up. So
and is that lower than bond interest rates are about 1 to 2% as well, correct?
It is lower than the currently, because IEPA are low interest. So obviously we prefer the IEPA loan first. And if we need more funding, then yeah, we would go out in the bond.
So sorry, Dave, go ahead.
in the future, the thought is that the money that we will probably borrow or obtain through the IEPA for the lead service line replacement, some of that will be principal forgiveness. They still call it a loan, but they call it a principal forgiveness loan. And the word out that we're hearing now is that 50% of the loan will be principal forgiveness, and the other 50% will be at the low interest rate. So as funding becomes available and something as large as lead service line replacement program, they realize they need to make more money available for all the communities.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, just my last clarification here. What is, if I'm wrong on the the general obligation bonds being about 1 to 2%. What is the rough, just average percentage of? And I know it certainly goes up as we get closer
Right.
to the.
It
Yeah.
depends on the market, changes by the year. I mean, it has gone up compared to the last year. Obviously, it was the lowest point when we hit the COVID in 2020. Then it jumped back, and it continues because of this expectation of rate rise. Yeah. So it might go up to like a 2.5 to 3%. Yeah.
Okay. So that's roughly
Right.
about a normal percentage rate for the.
Right.
Okay. 2.5.
And that's the general comment I would make for everyone, that, yeah, I mean, it lot depends on the interest rate environment and economy, which is beyond our control, you know. I mean, last 6 months or a year, I heard that so many communities issued so much of the bonds, and not just for capital project, but for pensions too, because the interest rate environment was very low. And I have seen, and you must have seen that the rates would, like, if we see 4 or 5 rate increase this year, within a couple of years, the rate might be close to 4 or 5% bonds. We have issued the bonds at 5, 6%, you know. So many communities wanted to take advantage of this kind of a low interest environment. And so even I heard some of the communities issued the bonds of tune of 50 to 75 to 100 million for funding the pension. So just, yeah, I mean, the point is here, it lot depends on the interest rate environment and economy. And unfortunately, we don't control that.
Mhm.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Laura, do you want to continue? Good discussion, everyone.
Laura, you're muted. You need to turn your mic on.
The last thing I would say is just that when you look at these timeframes for the larger projects, these projects are taking like 5, 7, 8 years to get done, from conception to when we're done in construction. And council elections are every 4 years. So you may see situations when you're doing a Sheridan Road project or Howard Street corridor project where we definitely are bridging across multiple councils. And if we as a community want to do those projects and we want to get federal funding for those projects, then we have to have a certain amount of continuity in how we do projects, which is not to say we couldn't all of a sudden decide to cancel a project, but we will have spent money and at that point. So I recognize that we had a big turnover in the council this year, and a lot of people were surprised that we're already midway through a bunch of projects, and we'll be lucky to finish some of these projects before the council turns over again. So it's just a fact of life when doing these really large capital projects. Oh.
Leslie.
I have a question, Lara. Like, who is responsible for, when you do a big capital project like Crown, for example, who is responsible then for figuring out what maintenance is going to look like on those projects going forward? Because I think maintenance on Crown is 4 times as much or 3 times as much as we said it would be, based on information that you provided prior to its construction. So, I mean, it's one thing to have all these, CIP projects and everything all laid out, but then we're stuck trying to maintain something that we had no idea was going to be as expensive as it was. And I think that's why it gives people pause when you start talking about big construction projects like the pet shelter as an example.
Sure. So on the Crown project, those projections, a lot of that was done by Marty Lyons and Lawrence Hemingway. And on the animal shelter, I think we're trying to work with the consultant to have a good understanding of the maintenance. But since the animal shelter is largely operated through donations directly to the Evanston Animal Shelter Association, it's a little bit like the city is getting a subsidized service that's subsidized through private donation. And so that's just the model that we've been operating under.
Just to clarify, then you're saying that that organization will pay for the funding of the maintenance?
So the way that our current contract is structured, and this is anticipated to continue, is with the Evanston Animal Shelter Association. The city gives them, I want to say $100,000 to $200,000 a year. I think it's $100,000, where we give them $50,000. We used to give them $50,000 for supplies and $50,000 for staff salaries. Now we just give them $100,000. And then I do believe the city pays like electricity costs on the building. But in terms of most of the staffing, the programs, the supplies the animals need, all of that is paid for through pretty much, minus the $100,000, the donations of residents. And they have like a $400,000, $500,000 a year budget.
And then have you gone in and tapped that maintenance fund that Crown, for Crown, given that we have all these cost overruns on maintenance for that building?
We are starting to look at it for some projects that are relatively small, but under a contract that we have in the memorandum of understanding with the Friends of Crown, there are limited options for how we can expend that. And that was put in because a major donor, which was the Crown family, set that requirement, or else we would not have gotten their $5 million donation.
Yeah, I read that funding and it's pretty broad.
Yeah, it is.
I read that
it really, though, is intended for capital improvement, I guess, even though it's called maintenance fund. It's intended for small or large capital improvement projects at Crown. It's not intended for staff salaries, for example, or other types of annual operating costs.
But I think, it seems to me, going back to the whole point of having funds just sitting there earning basis points, that, wouldn't you rather spend it on that? And really the language is very broad.
And also the
I
city
do think,
contributes to that fund.
sorry?
I think the city gives a certain.
And it's our, so it seems a little silly to me to put money into a fund that sits in an account earning absolutely nothing. And then we're, moving funds over to fund, these cost overruns. That makes no sense to me.
So I had zero to do with setting up any of these requirements, but my understanding at the time was that the Crown family would not give the city a $5 million donation because they had donated to the previous Crown Center, and 10 years in, when there were major capital costs, the city chose not to pay them. The last 20 years of the previous Crown Center operation, the city put $0 into capital improvement for that building. And so the Crown family wanted that money to accumulate over time so that 10 years down the road, when it was needed, it would be there. And that was the condition that them giving the $5 million to the city of Evanston. But I had nothing to do with that negotiation. It was negotiated largely by Marty Lyons, who is no longer with the city. But my understanding is,
understood, but
it's a question of, does the city want to honor the spirit of a large major donor asking for this in return for we would be able to fund capital program 5 years, 10 years down the road.
Is that available? What the Crown family wrote regarding this maintenance fund?
I have
it.
Well,
So,
no,
the contract
Crown
and the MOU with Friends of Crown is definitely available. The
the
Crown
MOU, but
family's verbal request, I do not know.
yeah, I don't.
It really is broad. It says maintenance. It doesn't say capital expenditures.
Okay, everyone, I'd like us to stay. I think these are really good questions. They're and we need to dig into this, but I really would like us to stay on the major topic of this conversation about the CIP budget and how the projects are made. There are really important issues on all of these things we need to get to, but that I think going after City Engineer Biggs on Robert Crown right now, that's not the topic of the evening. I want to have a discussion about our CIP tonight.
Sure. I just want to say that we are looking at CIP projects coming up, and I think it is important that we do pause and look at what we've done right and wrong in terms of investing in future ones where we end up with maintenance costs.
Claire, I agree, but I'd like us to get through Ms. Biggs' presentation first, and then talk about some of the larger issues about about our the level that we bond and some of the other things before we dig into these very specific issues. So Laura, go ahead, please.
Sure. Okay, so because this is supposed to flow, so I'm sorry, because we've already talked about this a lot. But when we look at how much is sitting in that capital fund balance, actually quite a lot of it is obligated primarily to IDOT contracts, but also to other contracts that just go over multiple years, whether or not they're IDOT funded. So when you look at the 2022 budget, the fund assets were $13 million at the beginning of the year. And then we ran a list of what all the obligations are. We ran a report, and our outstanding obligations for that $13 million includes $12.5 million is already pretty much obligated, of which $7.5 million, almost $8 million is for IDOT projects. Hold on one second. Okay. So again, this shows if we look at just the obligations that the city of Evanston entered into prior to 2020, 92% of those are due to IDOT's billing practices. And most of that is Sheridan Road, Chicago Avenue, although there is some funding from Emerson Ridge, Green Bay. So I guess what I feel like some of the major takeaways are from this conversation is that, which we're about to talk about a little further, is that of all of our funding sources, only general obligation bonds are basically unrestricted in how we spend them. And we usually do have an annual target, but as we move forward, most of that money actually goes to parks and facilities. So when you look at how we get money for the street resurfacing, the water main, the sewer, transportation, all those things that we think of as like being in the roadway, it's $39.5 million that's budgeted. And GO bonds are only 4.1 million of that. So that is only 11% of the budget that we're spending on streets, water main, all of that.
Laura, how if you could go back to that previous
Sure.
slide, how much of the non-purple pie is debt? The IEPA loan, clearly
The
that's
IEPA
debt.
loans is a big number, but that is the majority of loans that we receive for the IEPA. So this is like really getting into the weeds, but the majority of loans we receive from the IEPA are for projects at the water plant historically. It's not entirely true. We do get some sewer loans, but we had a lot of sewer loans and those are all going away. They're getting paid off, and the new sewer loans are relatively small amount comparatively. And so we're talking about water plant projects, and water plant projects, our wholesale customers pay at least 90%. It depends on the life of the asset.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Totally makes sense.
So
But
those are tremendously cost-effective loans. We often make money on those projects after like 20 years, 50 years down the road. Those are a huge income generator for the water fund, actually, because of the way that the rate is calculated.
yeah,
Yeah.
but of this total pie of $39.5 million, it's mostly debt in one way, shape, or form, whether it's a loan or a bond or another kind of bond.
Yes.
And a lot of that debt, at least for water fund, is paid off by other people, which works out really well for us. So that's not a bad thing.
does.
It's just so I understand the lay of the land here.
And Jonathan, on that point, just to a bit of history was those IEPA low interest loans were how we paid for the biggest public works project that Evanston ever undertook, which was the $160 million long range sewer plan, which took approximately 20 years. And but it was because of those IEPA loans, and Laura and Dave, correct me if I've got this wrong, that we were able to do that. And those loans were paid off by the city of Evanston. So now it's nice to have somebody else paying 90% of them. Okay, I have a couple of hands here.
Do you mind if I ask a quick question before I have to drop off?
I'm sorry, Devon, what did you say?
I said, do you mind? I have to drop off in 2 minutes. Do you mind if I ask a quick question before then? I know other folks had their hands up before I did. So just, or just a statement actually. Laura, I do hear you saying that the GO bonds are the most flexible funding source that we are currently using. The only thing I want to note is that we do not have to use GO bonds in that, if we just raise the necessary revenue or raise additional revenue to offset some of those bonds, and of course we likely couldn't offset all of it, but offset more of it, we'd have the same flexibility without the increased, cost for borrowing the money. Just want to note that.
Yes, that is 100% true.
And Devon, that's a topic that we need to tackle here at this committee. How do we borrow less, but still get everything that we need to get paid for? So Leslie, you've had your hand up for a long time, and then I have Sherry.
No, I think I already asked my question, but thank you.
Okay, Sherry?
Yeah, real quick, can you back up, Laura? Because it looked like this, can you go one slide before one more? So it looked like pre-funding, this was 13 million, and then the next slide on 2020, pre was a lot less. Go to the next slide.
Oh, that's because
It just seemed like a lot. There was from 7.9 to 3 point something on the next. What's the big difference there?
So 2020 and 2021 are the big differences. So this slide includes everything that happened up till the end of 2021. And there are some old obligations that are hanging out there. But primarily, once we get a couple years out and we look at pre-2020, then it's all IDOT. Like IDOT is the source of this situation.
Okay, it just looked like there was a big difference there, and I was trying to reconcile that. So,
and there is. The further back in time you go, the less that we have obligated for obvious reasons. Like eventually these things all get paid off.
And Lara, was that an
Thank you.
example of waiting for a project to close out? And we're just waiting to get the final bill and then we'll pay it?
Yeah. And again, I don't know when that'll be. And we'll only know when we get a bill and say you have 60 days to pay or you won't get any more funding from the state until you pay it.
So this is where a short-term debt instrument might be able to help us out. If I'm understanding where David's coming from.
So yes, except that I don't pretend to understand what is a good financial practice for short-term versus long-term debt.
It lot depends on the interest rate environment. And as I said, particularly if it's a low rate environment, it's a fixed rate in GO bonds, So if I'm paying like 3%, 3.5%, 4%, which I've locked in now after 20 years, and with the inflation and all that, it might be a lot less than what we are there. In the, variable rate, or where you go for a line of credit, obviously it is tied into an index, And in the past, many years back, I think in 99, 2000, 2002, Citi had issued the variable bonds, and once the rates kept going up, we had to refund it with the fixed rate bond. So
I don't think that that's what David's talking about, though. He's talking about a line of credit, and so that you're using essentially as a bridge. So given the yield curve, his point is, if you're down here on the yield curve for short-term rates, it's very unlikely that you're ever going to hit what you would with a bond. So
also, if you're only paying interest on $1 million,
right,
what you're using versus paying 3% on 4 million, even if you're paying higher interest rate for short term, you're paying on a lot less. So it's just an analysis that we have to do versus what do we really need short term versus money sitting and not earning. I think that's what
right. And as Lara pointed out, the biggest uncertainty with the IDOT that we could need the money in 6 months or a year or sometimes 5 years, and we don't know. And I know IDOT has issues with not just us, but throughout the state. And so, that's big uncertainty. Sometimes, doesn't help us in a kind of right funding source.
Sherry, did you just raise your hand again?
Just, yeah, I have a very quick question. So if we do the bond and we know we don't need the money for 18 months or so, do we ever try to do short-term treasuries, any kind of investment vehicles, or we can't do that?
No, we can do that. We can invest it in the bank as long as we make it. That's why we have to do every year what we call arbitrage calculation and file the report, So our third party, the financial advisors, they prepare this report and for the IRS purpose, yes. And luckily, so far, I don't know, at least in last year, 10 years that we have paid any arbitrage rebate,
I do want to caution a certain amount of care as we do this research, because the industry standard is that when the money is spent, you have the money in the bank when the contractor builds it. And IDOT deals with hundreds of communities and agencies and dealing with their federal funds for this and that for other projects. And their expectation, I perceive, is that the city of Evanston has the money to pay them when the contractor does the work. So
Wouldn't they
we
be
have to be
indifferent?
very
Lar-
careful, or we
Right.
will no longer get federal funds.
So I guess the
project.
question to them maybe, or to some financial advisor is having capacity or a line of credit enough? Because you could pay it off and then, bond for it subsequently.
Yes.
So you're not sitting there with all this slush money in a big account earning next to nothing.
And those are good points. And one of those things which I encountered during the COVID, that I reached out to one of the bank for a line of credit. And their condition was that, they say, okay, rate would be this much, but even if you don't use, we would charge you 15 basis points. Luckily, I did not go with that bank and went with the other bank. But think about, we never used a dime, even in 2020 or 21, out of line of credit. I kept it open so that in case we needed, somehow we did pretty good in 2020 and even in 21. But one of the bank has this condition that we would charge you for the unused money.
A bank's gonna, working, I work in the banking industry. We're always gonna ask you for fees, but
Okay, Laura, do you want to continue?
Sure. So this is the presentation, or this is the numbers that you see, that geo bonds are only 11% of our street resurfacing right-of-way type projects. But if we move to parks projects, geo bonds are 89% of the parks funding. And if you look at facilities, we actually have like a really weird situation, because normally it's 100% of facilities. I am unaware of any grants that are available for doing facilities work at this time. And I know that people said, oh, you could get money from this or that, but these grant programs I have not ever seen in my time as city engineer. So normally we don't have proceeds from the sale of city property, and normally we don't have ARPA grants, which we've assigned to pay for the structural repairs of the parking garage project. So normally it is 100% geo bond, and parks is 90% geo bond. So when we talk about, oh, we'll just delay projects and then we will not issue as much debt, you're essentially just talking about parks and facilities. A lot of the other stuff we potentially could figure out, but parks and facilities do not have another source of funding.
Laura, I have a hand raised by David.
Sure. So is some of that funding just current property taxes, current city funding, that part of it's bonded, but some of it is just the current revenues being generated by the city? Is that the
No,
typically
it
the
is
difference?
geo
It's not.
bond debt. That's the purple geo bond.
No, but the 30%. The 30% you said it doesn't normally exist. Is that just current funding?
We sold the North Branch Library building,
Mm-hmm.
and that generated $800,000 ish, and that is being designated to pay for a public works storage facility building to assist in replacing the recycling center. Now, the cost of the public works storage building is going to be more than $800,000, so the remainder will come from the sale of the recycling center, theoretically, although the council could choose to do something else. But the idea, I think, behind this was that the recycling center would be put back on the tax roll, so ultimately be a win-win for the city. And then ARPA funds are totally just the one-off funds.
Right. Right. So I'm just saying in normal times, if GEO is 90% of facilities, 10% might just be coming from current funding.
Well, I will say
no?
parking garage revenue does pay for parking garage assets, which are, when they are garages, come from the facilities. But any non-parking fund asset that is a facility, Crown, Chandler, Levy, Civic Center, the park shelters, Ackerman Park Shelter or Lovelace Park Fieldhouse, all of that is paid for by GEO bond debt. There's no other option that I'm aware of at this time. Now, GEO bonds actually, we budget, and if you look at this annual line item, we actually do the budget and have the discussion late in the year, but we don't sell the bonds till mid-year. So each year there's kind of this standard thing. January, we pass a resolution based on what the adopted budget is for how much we're going to sell in bonds. But then we monitor the bonds. Some projects don't move forward, either staffing issues or often just because something comes up and it's just not feasible to do the project as intended. In which case, when we go to the bond sale, we will modify the bond sales based on what's been happening in January through June to get to the final bond numbers. And then by then we're already reviewing, well, what are we going to do next year in the capital program and trying to figure out if we bonded so much this year, how much do we bond next year for these projects that are on a continuum over the year. And then we have the bond discussion again in October through December, and then it all starts over again. So the bonds are sort of continuously monitored, and how much we actually sell is not really set through July to August. But I will tell you that once we have that January bond resolution, the staff assumes that as permission and they start work. Now, each project, as it is approved, the bond funding for an individual project is approved by City Council. But the staff basically begins work as soon as the budget is adopted. But the bond itself is not settled what it's going to be until midsummer.
And council does approve that when it is issued at that point.
Yes, council knows. And in the bond resolution, in the bond memo for the bond sale, there's usually a table. There is a table that says, we told you we were going to sell bonds and this is how it was going to be divided amongst the project. Here's how we actually propose to sell bonds. And you'll see some of the projects are zeroed out. Every once in a while, there's a critical project where the bond numbers increase, but it is always offset by the decreases in projects that are not getting completed.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So what role, if any, will this committee play in, May, June, July?
I do not know, because that's typically always just been the staff trying to understand what the city needs are. And my understanding of this committee when it was formed is they're looking at like the long-term problems, but certainly, I mean, we can get together the proposed staff needs and bring them to this committee in July and say, here's what the staff thinks we need. It is quite a process, I will tell you. It's not like we have one meeting in May and then we sit around until July. Like, there's a lot that happens May, June, July.
Yeah.
To get the CIP.
I mean, how could this committee be useful?
I think that this committee needs to decide at what level it wants to be at, and that's not my decision to make.
Right. I think that's up to us as we assess the situation. That's why we came together, right? So that we can improve the financial situation of our city functioning. So
Yeah, but I'm just asking
how
can we utilize our energy and enthusiasm most efficiently and most
I will
appropriately to achieve that.
I will tell you that parks and facilities in particular have been dramatically underfunded for the last 25 years. And almost every building that exists, there's no building system, whether it's the roof, the HVAC, the structure, the foundation, none of those systems can go 25 years without capital improvement. So 5 years ago, we embarked on a larger facilities capital improvement program to do the emergency style projects where the electrical panels are failing and there's life safety issues. And we have caught up on, like, there's dramatic emergencies. I won't say they're all solved, but the global, like, all of these buildings, the bill is coming due is happening. So in the next 2 to 3 years, if you were to do the minimum necessary to keep the buildings functioning as is, it will probably be dramatically more than what you've been spending.
Right. So, I mean, I think that is one of the key issues, is that we are bonding out on maintenance. And I think we need to really do a full assessment on maintenance needs. Like, I argued at AP&W, like bonding out to do, take care of potholes. Like, there is a certain amount, and we need to have long-term projections on maintenance needs for all our, parks and rec and everything else before we decide to take on a new project. Or if we do want to take it on, at least we know what we're going to be up against to decide really how much we do have available to spend without overburdening the residents.
And I think an issue for this committee, in my mind, to decide to attack, and this, and we could spend, and I think it's something that we really need to address, is this fundamental issue of how do we avoid what you're describing, Claire? How do we realign our borrowing so it is appropriate to what we're borrowing for? And what are ways in which other communities handle this? What are possible solutions for Evanston to reduce that bonding rate? But clearly we're at a precipice here with our parks and facilities. And I think what Laura is telling us is that we need to come up with some new solutions for the council and for the city, and educate everyone in Evanston about why we're going to have to make some, I think, pretty dramatic decisions about going forward, because we can't operate the city without all of that backstage stuff that people don't see, the service center, those places that the public doesn't necessarily go, but essentially keep Evanston running every day. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and so we need to figure out, okay, what do we go out and bond for, and what are ways in which we can find other sources of revenue to pay for those maintenance costs, and those operating costs. So,
and I'd like to just echo back something, if I could, Claire, that I think I heard David say, which is, yes, we need to keep an eye on how much we're borrowing, although it's not so important what we're using that money for from a high level financial perspective. Is that an accurate assessment of?
Well, I think we need a measure to understand, do we have relatively more or less debt globally, right? Again, money's all fungible. What you're borrowing for is a piece of what you're spending, almost regardless of what it is. So if you think about a company, you would think about, is this company getting a higher relationship between debt and earnings? Well, what's our equivalent relationship, so we can really see, is our relative debt level growing over time? Because some growth should be growing with the community, growing with the revenue base, because there is a value to not have to pay for everything today.
right.
But that becomes out of whack if over time you realize, oh, we've doubled our relative debt load. So that's what I really want to understand is what has happened to the best way to measure it, I don't know. what's happened to our relative debt load over time,
Mhm.
and how much debt should we be issuing on an annual
And
basis to
that's
fund
really the true
capital?
measure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's the true measurement of financial health. Right?
I
Is
think
that
so.
debt load compared to our
Revenues or whatever
Right.
that.
Right.
For
And whether
example, I
we're
know-
using that debt load, whether we're using the debt to pay for Robert Crown or pay for this pen or pay for a fire truck.
And some of it's a rollover. Some of it's a rollover prior
Yeah.
debt, right? So
Well-
that's another element.
I mean, we have to make
Okay.
sure we're delivering the services that people need, right? And
Mhm.
so if we're not, yet our debt is increasing. I know I had a study done on per capita expenditures in all the surrounding cities, and we're way up at the top. And I'm not talking about debt right now. I'm not talking about tax levy. I'm just talking about per capita, what our city spends. I mean, we're really high. We're at the top. So, but well at the top above every surrounding city. So I think we need to look at that, like, you know, for example, and I think that, you know, jives with what David's saying. Like, we have to look at our debt and how it relates to how much it's been growing, the rate.
But in addition to that, we also need to pay attention to what it is that we need as fundamentally, as you said, Claire, to keep the city services being provided, so that, you know, our facilities are, as Lara just referenced, you know, we need to rebuild, renovate, make up for 25 years of failed maintenance, and then we have to decide what do we do about our parks, because, you know, those are always being used, always needing maintenance, and, you know, safety standards change, equipment is worn out, and so how do we make sure our parks stay safe and usable by the public in ways that the public wants them to be because of the community we live in? And, you know, those are two really difficult questions here that we're facing, because we have to figure out, where does the money come from for that?
Right. But I think for the first time, like, I've been demanding, you know, some projections, or we all did. I think our finance committee did. And we have not been doing that as a city. And I think that's some direction we can give, because I think we need to look at long-term planning. Of course, we're not going to get it exact, but we need to know, just like other cities do, 5-10 years down the road, maintenance, and then we can look at where, like, you know, what we can afford in terms of increases in debt for projects.
Well, and also our assets. What's the condition of our assets? Where are we in terms of needing to renovate, rebuild, repair? You know, we need to have that that we're looking at, because that's going to be something just as important as maintenance. I mean, they go hand in hand. You know, you build a new building, you need a maintenance budget. Or you repair a building, and you need a maintenance budget to make sure that the repair stays a repair.
40 years ago, in the late 70s, early 80s, the city went on a major acquisition spree where they acquired many buildings, school buildings or other buildings that were at the end of their useful life that were no longer be used for their original purpose, or they built new buildings, such as in the case of the service center. And then they proceeded to spend, at least in the last 20 years, almost no money on the maintenance of these buildings. So many of these buildings are minimum of 40 years old and have not had substantial funding put into them. So for example, we know as staff, there's a ton of work needed at the service center. Roll-up doors to the bays where the trucks are stored don't work very well. The HVAC systems are all starting to fail. And so we engaged a consultant for the master plan, knowing that the fuel system for how we fuel city vehicles is not going to last long enough to get to the end of the master plan. And we will probably have to do that this year if we're being responsible, or if we want to continue to fuel city vehicles at the service center. We will need to replace the fuel system. And we're just trying to get to a minimum level of complete on the master plan so we can do it appropriate to other things that are being recommended at the building if the site's going to be reconfigured or something. And we will come back to the city council with a report in a few months about the recommendations that are coming out of that master plan. But we don't have the money, and I personally have no desire to continue to bond all of our facilities improvement costs. We don't have the money at the current levels of bonding to pay for the improvements needed at the service center to keep it in operation in the long haul. I'm happy to come here as often as you need to have this done. And I'm fine if we want to go through the CIP and we want to figure out long-term how to delay projects. We have recently, in the last 4 or 5 months, hired a management analyst in Public Works, which is really assisting us with being able to get better grip on what money is in the capital fund and how it's being used. So we will continue to work to run the analyses you need. But I think one of the big roles of the committee, if it were up to me, would be to figure out how we should be funding things that is not necessarily debt. Debt has a place, but I don't love how much debt we use. It's just the budget. I mean, 6 years ago, I was given this job. At that time, we didn't even really have a 5-year CIP. So we've made a lot of progress over the last 6 years, but I was basically handed a situation like, that's debt paid. Just issue GO bonds for these types of projects. And there's not been a chance to discuss a different way.
I mean, over the last 5 years, hasn't our debt gone from like 140 to almost 200?
It's around 189 million, I think, as of December.
Right.
And that's the one of the point, I think, when Lara said that we have set that number for a couple of reasons, the $10 million for the tax-supported debt. We generally pay $10 million in principal every year. So we want to just make sure that we don't add additional principal amount, to our debt. Even when we issue the new bonds, we pay off around $10 million. And then second thing is, obviously, if we stay under 10 million, we have a couple of members from the banking industry. They know that, yeah, it's like eligible as a bank qualified. So we get a better rate if we stay under 10 million. So these are the couple of reasons. But big reason is, yeah, we just want to make sure that, yeah, we pay off the kind of same amount for which we are issuing the new bonds.
Well, Laura, I think you've given us a major topic that that obviously the city needs to address, that we need to change what we've been doing because it has brought us to this point. And we need to rethink how we should be funding things in order to reduce that debt number or use the debt differently. And I'll say, as the chair, and I think all of us here, we'd love to have you back to work on these issues because, this is fundamental to, the economic health of our city. And then what else happens in our budget? What is the other money that, what is left to spend on the other new projects and new ideas that come up? Claire. Mm-hmm.
So I just, one last little thing I think that'll help with like budgetary discipline. I would like to see that, when we have a CIP budget, that we're not asking that it be amended after we've exceeded it, but only before. I just think that's really important in terms of, sort of keeping in check a little bit, anyway, our spending to ensure, I think if everybody understands that really we want council to vote on increasing the CIP budget before it gets done. So I don't know whether like this committee has to make I think that's kind of supposed to be par for course, I think, in municipal budgeting, but if we need to, that would be the kind of thing I'd love to see our committee push forward, is that exceeding like a CIP budget is that be amended, that be brought to council to be amended beforehand. Ideally, we don't exceed it, but if it's going to be, I'd much rather not be voting afterwards to approve an already a budget that's been exceeded, for example. Those are the kind of things I think we could, as a finance and budget committee, right away could help to sort of rein in some degree of spending.
Okay. Laura, did you want to continue? Do you have more that you want to?
This is actually my last slide, so
okay. Mm-hmm.
I can stop presenting.
Oh, thank you. Committee, thoughts? It's a lot to think about.
So what,
Jonathan?
Laura, what do you have on paper, a 5-year projection for capital improvements?
So, sort of. We do have a 5-year projection. I don't know that all those projects need to be in 5 years. It's more been just like the laundry list of things that need to be done. And so staff can go through and start looking at legitimately what has to happen. I think part of the issue that we face in the CIP is there's things like we're going to have to take playground equipment. We need to fix this park versus other things that are more aspirational in terms, like incorporating carp. And I'm totally all for incorporating carp. So I'm not trying to pick on that, but we're balancing not just, one thing, only do the emergency stuff that's failing. We actually have multiple goals that we're always trying to balance. But yeah, we can go through and we could say generally what our list is over 5 years. We expect to spend this much money and then start parsing it out based on what we know. Parks and facilities will be almost all debt funded, and make preliminary projections about how much debt we need. And that could perhaps move the needle forward. But I think it should be understood that what's going to happen in the city 5 years from now, I really have no idea which facilities are going to fail, because 5 years ago, I could not have predicted that, for instance, we had a near catastrophic failure of the Lee Center HVAC, and I wasn't expecting that. It just happened. And then we've been scrambling for the last year and a half to get it fixed. And every time we fix something, there's another something that needs to be fixed. We didn't anticipate Fire Station 4 is going to need all these repairs. So there's just always a lot of stuff that comes up that we can't necessarily predict.
Yeah. But if perished thought, within 2-3 years, we're going to be talking about a potential tax increase. The sooner we know what's in front of us in the short to medium term and into long-term future, the more informed we can be when we get to that point and we have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have budgeted this year, we're about to issue a request for proposal on a park strategic plan, which will better help us understand what we need to do with our park system. Similarly, we have the master plan for the service center. 5 years ago, we did a roof inspection, 6 years ago, and last year we finished another roof inspection because we made a bunch of roof repairs, and roofs just don't have that long of a life. So we're waiting for that report to happen. So we have a lot of stuff that we're kind of trying to gather together so we can get better financial projections as well.
Mm-hmm. I have Sherry's hand and Dave Stoneback's hand.
Yeah, I mean, just as far as we're talking about our committee, because to come to us for every little thing would be very difficult for you, but maybe on a quarterly basis, we could say if there's an unexpected expenditure above 100,000 or 50,000, maybe there could be a report that comes to our committee so that at the end of the year, we're not surprised that all these things happened. And the other question I have, do we budget just a general amount for unexpected, like the Levy Center? Do we put like a 5% reserve for unexpected things that could happen that we're not budgeted for?
In the GO bond we issue, there's a line item that's $600,000 for facilities contingency, which are generally fairly emergency repairs or overruns on projects where the bids just came in too high, but we think the project's important enough, we want to proceed anyway. And we also have $100,000 for parks contingency similarly.
And has that been enough historically, or have we exceeded that?
No,
last year
we exceeded. I mean, we had a surplus in the contingency.
Last year we exceeded the facilities contingency, but Fire Station 4 ended up being very expensive. The previous year,
in Parks and Rec,
$600,000 was a surplus.
Right, a surplus in Parks and Rec in the contingency.
We have sometimes had a contingency surplus, but if you average it over several years, that ends up being the right amount that we've been seeing is the 100 and the 600.
Dave?
Hi, and we're struggling for the CIP, but realize like generally we're repairing the playground equipment at one park a year. And we have, I think, 47 playgrounds, and playgrounds have a 15-year life. And so if you just do the math there, every year you should be restoring 3 playgrounds.
Right.
But we restore 1 playground a year. And that's because we're limited by how much work we can do, by how much bond we can sell, unless there's a new revenue stream that can help us fund repairs in ways other than selling GO bonds. And it's the same thing with street resurfacing. When you pave a street, it has 20 years life. I don't recall how many miles of street we have a year or in Evanston, but we are not paving as many streets a year as we should if we want to meet each street having a 20-year life. Maybe we should be doing 7 to 8 miles a year, because if we have 160 miles and it has a 20-year life, then you need to do 8 miles a year. And we're doing 3, maybe 4. So that, with the funding that we have now, staff is struggling to prioritize which park we repair, things like that. So we would welcome your opinion as to what we should do or how we should get out of that. One of the things along with Lara is try to demonstrate that to you, to show what the life cycle is for this. I know Councilmember Reed talked about taking the money out of the parking fund to the general fund. But I can also tell you, when we needed to do major repairs of a parking garage, the parking fund had no bandwidth, no money in reserves at all to help fund for that. And so that year there was a major bond issue just to rehabilitate a parking garage. So I agree that we should be looking out and looking at 10, 15 plants. At the water plant, we try to plan for 30 years out, because some of our assets would be very expensive to replace. And so we have to, I agree that we should be looking at that, and I will work with staff to try to get some of these.
Yeah, Dave locked up. Can everyone else still?
Yeah, Dave,
No,
you just
okay.
froze a little bit. Oops. Dave is still frozen for me. Is he frozen for anybody else?
Yes.
Okay.
But I
Dave,
can see where he was going, which is to say that we could work to come up with some plans. I would say facilities is harder to do than parks or any of the other areas of the CIP. And it might be helpful if we look at one area of the CIP at a time in order to just try to break it down into more manageable chunks. You froze up for a lot of that, Dave.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I don't know how to handle it.
that's okay. Yeah. Well, Laura's point was just to look at one part of the CIP at a time, which I agree with. I think trying to mix them up, they have different needs and different timelines somewhat. But I do think that this would be worth doing. I think looking at facilities is really critically important here. I was on the council, when dinosaurs were young, when we did the last parks assessment, and that plan held us and kept us going for about 15 years. And we had a lot of parks that were in significantly behind maintenance, renovation actually. And then we embarked on the renovation plan that really renewed and took out a lot of old equipment and really renewed a lot of our parks. Clearly it's time to do that again. So I think we should do that. I'm looking forward to seeing what that says, Laura. But I also think we should decide on which of these parts of the CIP we want to concentrate on to figure out what is, take one, attack it. So Claire, you've had your hand up, and Bobby, you've had your hand up. So Claire, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I just want to emphasize again the long-term planning. And we know, we need to renovate whatever it is you said we need to do, so many parks every year, or you think we should do, but we're only doing, but those are kind of expenses we should be projecting out. And then maybe that, I feel funny talking about like just basic budgeting, but then, like maybe, we can't spend this much on this park because we kind of are at our limit. And I don't see us doing that, but I think that's what we need to start doing. Or if you get Salmon's Enterprises of Albion, covering the renovation for this park, then that freezes. But I just think we need to do those 5 and 10 year projections with this sort of expenses, big CIP expenses that we know we're going to have routinely, from streets and potholes to parks and installing new parks. And I just think that will be so essential to, creating a healthy budget, that long 5 to 10 year planning out.
Well, I think that is what we are getting from parks. Is that right, Laura? Am I?
No, so far we've been under budgeted, and we started from a place where we were doing almost no work 7 years ago, that we've really just dealt with things that are failed essentially.
But in the analysis that you just mentioned.
Yes, we haven't done that because we've been making a list of what's failing. But what we could do is we can make a list of all of the parks and do that. It's just would be hard for the staff to come back in 1 month and do that for the whole CIP. But we could, like 1 month at a time, look at sections of the CIP and kind of put the analysis together.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't want to, I don't want to, you have other things you need to do. I think we need to be mindful of your time, but also look at things that are substantive here on this committee that we can move the ball forward on. And I think Claire's right, having some sense, and you're right, you don't know where the city will be 5 years from now, because
Yeah, now Melissa's frozen.
I'm back now. Sorry, everybody. No, my dog did not just take a bite of the cord, but but I do think 5 years ago we didn't know COVID was coming. Probably some epidemiologist could have told us that, and and some of the other things, the Great Recession, what happened there. So, to the best of our ability, to the extent we can look up ahead, that's really important to do. So I'm looking to see who else had their hand up. Bobby, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll keep my video off so it doesn't freeze. But I think to the point of planning, what would be helpful for me, and maybe these things are already being considered, is either how we are or how we should go about prioritizing what goes first. Because I'm sorry for getting on late. Maybe this was touched on earlier in the call. Because right now what I'm hearing, and we've heard this even before tonight's conversation, is that we don't currently have enough budgeted to maintain our parks, our roads, our sidewalks, etc. So that's a big challenging issue to start off with. So for me, what would help is to understand, okay, how do we want to start prioritizing how we make these investments? And so I'd love to either participate in that or to just know how staff has done that before. For example, for parks, are we looking at census tract data and seeing where there's, and I'm saying specifically for playground equipment, not just kind of open green space, but for playground equipment, are we looking at where there's higher population of school-age children, or children who are, people who are much more likely to use playground equipment? Are we using that data to inform how we prioritize? Obviously, we can't resurface all our streets, so how are we doing the streets that are more highly utilized? What are we basing these decisions on? That would help me understand not only how we're approaching this, but possibly how we can approach it moving forward. But how are we deciding what is prioritized and what isn't? I think is really important information, because I don't think we're gonna get to a point in the short term where we find a magical fund where we can do all of this work and keep up with the pace that we've heard today. Every 15 years, I think, for playground equipment or whatever it was, and every 20 years for, it sounds like, for alleys and roads. But we can start thinking about how we want to prioritize our investments.
So I totally agree. The one thing I will say that we do pretty well in funding is water main. Water main has a 100-year life. We fund 1% replacement per year, which, because it was also underfunded for a while, will probably not be adequate at some point. But right now, it's keeping pace really well. And we work that into our budget. But I will tell you, we still don't pay for that out of cash. We mostly bond for the water main replacement. So, but we have a revenue fund that will pay the debt service, and it's built into our water rates that's how we're going to do it. So it's not necessarily the best planning, but it's pretty solid. And we know that it will mean that the water main system generally stays intact and manageable to do the repairs on. And we contrast that versus parks, where we probably have a pretty solid rule of thumb about what we should be doing, although playgrounds are not the only park amenity. Tennis courts, basketball courts, all those things have a different life. And there we're picking what's failing. Whatever's in the worst shape, that's what the maintenance staff recommends we do next. And so far, no alderman has ever said no when we come to them and say, your park is in the worst shape in the city. Should we do that next year? So,
and Bobby, I'll tell you that the third ward had the only park that had either a D- or F grade. And we finally did get to it, and it took 30 years. So yes, and now it's just amazing. Unfortunately, it's turned into a bit of an informal dog park, I hear. So, but I believe our streets, Lara, correct me if I have this wrong, streets are by most in need, and that's what we repair.
Everything in the capital program is basically done based on what's breaking. So,
and I think we need more criteria than that. I mean, that's one good one, but I think I could rattle off like 3 other ones that I think we should add to that can help us hone it in even more. It's a good start, but I think there's other criteria that we can use to better prioritize, because that's tough, because everything is failing.
Well,
right?
what we're finding is that held us for a while. For the last 5 years, that's been okay. But then in the last year or so, it all of a sudden is not working okay.
Right.
Things are breaking and we're not being able to fix them. And yet, I am somewhat bound by this. I mean, I really try to live by this $10 million rule. I'm fine if any given project gets canceled, because that is a city council decision. My decision, or my job, is to tell you what the staff thinks needs to be done based on what we perceive the criteria are. And so far, the last 5 years, that criteria has largely been fix what's breaking, because there's a lot of stuff that's breaking. So we've been fixing that stuff. And we're not 100%. I mean, sometimes we guess wrong. A few years ago, there were like 14 water main breaks in a 5-block stretch of Central Street, because we were 1 year off in the year that we were going to replace the water main. So for 1 year, those people had to have their water shut off almost every other day all summer. So it was, we definitely do not get it right all the time. We're doing our best, but I am totally fine with using other criteria that are handed. If the city council says this project and not that project, then that's what's selected. I think what would be really helpful is to have really clear guidance, and also to just be able to set what the city council believes are good funding levels for each area of the CIP. And then we would try to live in them. And if we couldn't live in them, we would explain why we couldn't live in them.
And Laura, maybe in that, I think you said you were going out for an RFP to do something around parks. Maybe as part of that RFP or scope of work, we can ask them to what criteria would they recommend, and that can help inform possibly how we think through, roads and sidewalks and other things. But since we're already going out for an RFP for parks, hopefully that's one of the that's part of the scope of work, to have them develop a criteria other than what's failing. Because then I think it leaves us open to, all right, what, the aldermen who advocate for their parks, because I have several parks that I think we all would agree are failing. And so, does the alderman that reaches out to staff more, alerting them about the failing park, get the investment in their ward, or is there some other process that supersedes that? And that's why I think it's important to have a fully fleshed out, criteria, because then it opens it up for kind of aldermanic, prerogative or pressure or whatever it is. So, but that's all.
And Bobby, I can talk to you offline about how we have handled that in the past on the council to make sure that there has been, when we have an equal number of problems, and I can talk to you offline about what we've done in the past to make sure that that we have a system and it's not the squeakiest wheel, but it's that it's something that the council agreed on, and it's a plan that we followed. And I'll be happy to talk with you about that offline.
Parks and facilities have largely been based on staff saying the maintenance issues. However, I'll use the example of tennis courts. If residents are complaining that this tennis court is out of service and Parks and Rec is taking these complaints, the maintenance staff is getting these complaints. I mean, yes, if we have like 50 residents complaining about a tennis court, that definitely elevates it. So it is a balancing act. But when the staff is putting together the CIP, the things that are maintenance problems are rising to the top, and it's being done like based on what's breaking, what's next. Now, there are projects that jump the line because there's community development block grant funding and TIF funding that can only be spent in certain geographic areas. And those areas do get more than what their fair share is, by straight numbers, but they are obviously prioritized because they had serious needs or they would not be in those categories. So we do spend more in those spaces, generally speaking, and some of those projects that get done from TIF or CDBG are not the worst situations, but nobody is just frivolously spending money on a CIP project that has no basis. There's not some like, hey, we're going into a specific area and fixing a perfectly good park because that alderman complained more than the other alderman.
Yeah, I guess
Bobby,
the
I'm going to stop you there, Bobby, because I have Jonathan who's had his hand up for quite a long time.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Councilor.
Yeah.
Nope, yep.
So Lara, the strategic plan for the parks that's in process, is that part of our the broader comprehensive plan or broader strategic plan?
It is not, but its findings will likely be wrapped into the comprehensive plan or debated as part of the comprehensive plan. So we'll go out for RFP for that shortly. I expect that to be issued in the next few weeks, which probably means that sometime around April or May, a council recommendation will be made as to a consultant that we should go forward with. And then that process, which will probably take 8 to 12 months, will happen. And meanwhile, the comp plan theoretically will be going on simultaneously.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be like, they are separate processes, but they're not. They'll be intertwined.
Is the Parks and Recreation Committee involved in that process?
They should be. I believe they will be, but right now it's just the staff writing up an RFP.
Okay.
But yes, definitely that there'll be community engagement with the general community about getting their criteria and suggestions and comments. There will be engagement with maintenance staff. There'll be engagement with city council, I'm sure. It will be a full process.
Thanks, Lara. And I guess this maybe is not a question for you, but I'm still struggling to fully understand the scope of what's included in the broader comprehensive plan and the broader strategic plan. Because we often hear those being touted as one of the cures for what ails us right now And I think we have, I don't want to be caught off guard in learning sometime down the road that what we thought was going to be part of that plan was never intended to be in it. And we've missed that opportunity to, to solve problems more deliberately. So I'm not sure if anyone on this call can answer that, but that is a concern I have as a council member, is what is actually going into the broader strategic plan and comprehensive plan, and what's not, I guess, more importantly.
So I've definitely seen a draft of the RFP. They asked my opinion for comments. I can definitely reach out to Johanna and get some information that can be distributed to the city council about what's included in the scope.
Thanks, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, and Jonathan, I could talk to you offline about the last time we created a strategic plan. I'd be happy to talk with you about that process and what we went through. Initially, I'll tell you, there were members of the council at the time who were incredibly skeptical about creating they didn't see the point of it. And I think it was very helpful for us. And I'd be happy to talk with you about what we did before. I'm sure that there are probably new and different ways of doing it now. And also that probably there are different points of a strategic plan now than there were the last time.
Right. Right. I'm not questioning the need. I'm not questioning the benefit. I just want to know what's in it and what's not. So if we're talking about something that's not, we can address that issue, here and now, rather than punting that to later, assuming that the strategic plan is going to cover it or help us prioritize.
Yeah, I think a strategic plan, my thought, is when we've done this before, it's more global than the finance and budget. Finance and budget is certainly a part of it, but the strategic plan also includes police, fire, social services as well.
And I'm sharing this observation more generally. It's not a finance and budget committee thing necessarily.
Okay. I want to be mindful of our time here and start to think about wrapping this up. I have that it's 7:47. I think this has been a really useful discussion. It's embarking on it, not in any way reaching more than the introductory portion of it. And, committee, I think thoughts about where we go next, our next topic meeting. I think thank you, Laura and Dave Stonebeck and Hitesh for this presentation. There's a lot there. And I want to hear, there were a number of questions that were raised that I think are really important for us to get. There were a lot of questions raised that get answers to, so that we can, yes, I agree, Sherry. Sorry, Laura, that in order for us to continue to move forward in our work here, as we can all tell, this committee is really important. And right now the topic feels enormous. And I think we're going to have to figure out how to refine this down so that we actually are productive. And, we're going to have to take issues one at a time in some way in order for us to be, I think, for us to be useful. But I'm open to hearing from others about that.
Melissa, are we done now with our planned series of, educational meetings, or is there one more?
I was going to check with Hitesh on that. Hitesh,
yes, and the original plan for this meeting was for the pensions, but I think we delayed because we had a good discussion about debt last month. And then we thought that, okay, we should first talk about CIP. And obviously I mentioned that CIP and the related debt issue and funding, that would come first to you guys when we come to you in June, July with the debt ordinance. Then the pension funding would be later part in October, November as a part of the budget discussion. But if you want that, okay, let's have the pension discussion. That's a good discussion too. And particularly as in the current environment, what are some of the other committees doing? I can ask our actuary to come and talk to this committee.
Committee, I think that would be very useful. It's a core. It is a core issue for every municipality, and it's certainly a core issue for us. Hitesh, if we could have our actuary who presented, whose name is escaping me right now.
Right. But
yes.
yeah, from the actuary firm is Foster and Foster. So yeah, the person who presented
Yes.
at the last budget meeting, and I think everybody liked it. And you would have, even at this level, plenty of chance to kind of have a question answer.
And if I could suggest, it would be really good
I think
if they could give us projections over time, because my sense is that's what's crowding out everything else. It's the source of the issue for maintenance, and everything else is the relative increased need for pension contributions over time. And that's something we just have to understand and build into a model of how much money there is across the board, because unfortunately there is a spending category that will continue to grow and grow and grow because of obligations in the past. So that would be helpful.
I thank David.
So we're looking at one more meeting of educational seminars, and then buckling down to get to work and figuring out what our self-imposed work plan is going to be.
Yes.
So we talked about it before, but I know we can't have a majority of a quorum meeting, which would be 3, because we're 7. So majority would be 4. So 3 people can't meet, but 2 could meet. It just seems to me if there were, we should think about having folks, if people are interested and want to take up, 2 people work together to delve into issues of bonds, to delve into issues of, pensions, anything like that. I would just say, absolutely have at it, and that'll just expedite our own work so that we can have a bit bigger and better impact sooner for Evanston.
Claire, I think I don't disagree with that. I think that if we have folks who have a particular issue they want to attack in greater depth, I think that's a good idea.
So I'd say we can do that via email maybe, or just say, so-and-so and myself are going to take up this, or I'll work on this. We don't have to do that.
And then let Hitesh and Jessica know. And the reason why I'm pausing is Corporation Counsel, would that violate the Open Meetings Act if they let us know, if everyone says, I'm going to work on this committee? I'm just trying to make sure that no one does reply all. Remember, this is a critical point.
Yes, so I would just suggest individually emailing Hitesh and Jessica, and then Hitesh can send out an email once he's received everyone's responses, and let everyone know what everyone else chose. That way we won't violate Open Meetings Act.
Can you do a Google Doc where people just pick, or is that a violation?
I'm not sure if OMA has caught up to Google Docs. So my suggestion would just be to send it to Hitesh, and then he can send out the final one.
And then he's going to give us a list?
Yeah, and then he can give you the list. And then, of course, don't reply all to his email.
Can I add one more thing to that list? Should we prioritize after the education meetings what topics the group wants to work on as a whole as a priority? Like, should we vote on that, or who's going to decide what projects we're going to work on? And
so Sherry, I'm just going to ask you to do that, to make a list. I'm really good at delegating. If you'd consider writing the areas that you think, the different areas that we should be focusing on. I think if one person, then we can discuss it.
Well, I think anybody who wants to put something on the list should put it on the list, and they could send it into Hitesh.
I'm very collaborative. That's fine.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry.
I'll submit one item for consideration right now. I would like to take a look at our financial reports and see what has been coming to council, and see if we can evolve that into something even more useful.
And I just been thinking something way basic is, I'm not even sure who approves what has to go to council, what can be approved by staff. I mean, is there something that can get me up to speed on that?
There are certain purchasing policies, particularly for this, and we follow the state standard. Anything up to 25,000, the city manager can take the decision. Anything above the 25,000 contracts, and those go to the city council.
Is it on the website somewhere to find, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see, but yeah, we have the purchasing, and if not, yeah, I mean, we can share with you.
But there is the budget, and generally speaking, you don't exceed it without first getting, you don't amend the budget by exceeding it without first getting, and that's been sort of an issue over the years. So, but otherwise, 25,000 is sort of what you can just spend without approval.
That staff can make a decision about.
And even within the staff, we have different
Within
levels that directors
Right.
can go up to the city manager and likewise.
Yeah, and there is an emergency provision, so the city manager can authorize whatever $50,000 it costs for the air conditioning on Levy Center, and
Yes.
get retroactive permission for that.
Right.
And
Yeah,
I assume there's financial controls so that one person can't take money and all that, like all that.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, and even our auditors, that is the first thing they look at, what we call internal controls. That, okay, they cannot do everything, can approve the invoice, can wire the money, and can approve the wires, all those kind of things. Yeah, we have in place.
And I'd like to say our auditor, and I'm not remembering his name right now, but I did have a long conversation with him, and he was so happy. So it was like the first time a council member had ever like called him and talked to him. So I think any one of us, he seemed very amenable to, you know, to discussing budget and his assessment and how the auditing works and everything else. So I can share that name and number.
Yeah,
And-
Dan Berg.
And the audit is, the audit is presented to the city council once a year. And that usually is a lively discussion with a lot of questions coming from the council. Yeah. So I think if everyone could submit their topics that they would like to work on to Hitesh and Jessica, and Sherry, if you want to work on that as well, you know, I don't want to give you a job unless you've actually truly voluntold for it, you know, rather than.
No, I'm fine. I just don't know if I know all the topics, so maybe I'll talk to Hitesh and
Yes,
he and I can come up with a list, so.
thank you. That would be great. I really appreciate that. Anything else for the good of the order? Thank you, everyone. This was very, very helpful. And a prize is going to go to the person who has the most interesting background next time.
Goodbye.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, good night.
Thank
everybody.
you, Jeff. Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Hitesh. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Dave.
And thank you,
Right.
Councilmember Wayne here. Great job.
Okay, bye-bye now. Oops, that's not the one.